Okay, let's get started. Hi, my name is Kathy McCormick. I'm board president of the Perrot Memorial Library in Old Greenwich, Connecticut. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's program with author Deborah Goodrich Royce on her newly released second novel, Ruby Falls. I want to also thank the members of the Perrot Memorial Library Association, whose generous contributions make programs like these possible. If you're not a member, please consider joining. Details can be found on our website, perrotmemoriallibrary.org. Thank you also to Jess Reed and Craig Jones of Greenwich Point Marketing, who have helped Perrot all year long with our Zoom programming. They've done a great job keeping Perrot connected to the community during this difficult time. Copies of Ruby Falls, as well as Deborah's first book, Finding Mrs. Ford, are available at checkout at perrotlibrary.org or for purchase through Diane's Books. We'll put the link for both in the chat. You can also catch Deborah tomorrow at the Greenwich Historical Society Tavern Market, while she'll be doing a reading, and you can also get books signed as well. Tonight's program will also be recorded, and we'll send a link in the follow-up email. Now it is my honor to introduce local author and resident Deborah Royce Goodrich. After a long career in film as an actress and story editor, Deborah and her husband Chuck restored and reopened the Avon Theater Film Center in Stamford, and she serves on the governing boards of the New York Botanical Garden, Greenwich Historical Society, and serves on the advisory boards of the American Film Institute, the Greenwich International Film Festival, and the Preservation Society of Newport, and the Preservation Foundation of Palm Beach. Deborah and her husband, Chuck, have also restored several hotels, the Ocean House, one of the only 13 Triple Forbes five-star properties in the world, the Weekapaug Inn, and the Deer Mountain Inn, a bookstore, the Savoy in the Westerly, Rhode Island, and have completed numerous Main Street revitalization projects in Tannersville, New York, and Westerly, Rhode Island. They are currently about to break ground on a renovation of the United Theater Arts Complex in Westerly. Thank you so much for joining us, Deborah. It's a pleasure having you.
Thank you, Kathy. I'm so happy to be here. I wish I were in the beautiful Perrot Library where I was 2 years ago with my first book. But, you know, this is the next best thing, this crazy Zoomiverse we all live in. So thank you for having me. And I guess I'll just begin by reading a short section of my new book and then talking a little bit to you. And I do love hearing your questions and comments. So as long as there are no spoilers, because most of the people have not read the book yet. So, oh, and I have a cat now crying outside of the room, which is very spot on perfect for Ruby Falls. You can see right now I am in front of a banner that evokes this great cover, which we will talk about. So pay no attention to the cat in the background. Prologue. Then, 1968, Lookout Mountain. I was standing with my father in the pitch black dark, the blackest dark I'd ever seen in the few short years of my young life, and the blackest dark that I've seen since, which is a considerably longer span. The surrounding air was dank with flecks from falling water. A disembodied voice rose up from the mist, then swooped back down to submerge in it. First amplified, then muffled, the sounds changed places, each taking its turn at prominence. The drone of the voice, the roar of the falls, and the clammy damp came at me from all directions, from the sides, from above and below, to seal me in a viscous coating and stick me to my spot. The waterfall could have been anywhere, next to me, yards away. I dared not move a muscle. The woman's voice transfixed me with a tale of scuba divers, fearless swimmers who over the years had plumbed the depths of a fathomless pool, in wetsuits and tanks, in masks and flippers. Down they had plunged into icy water in an effort to find its bottom. No search had been successful. The roiling cascade dropped into a lake that continued, it seemed, to the center of the earth, to China, to horrible depths my imagination was fully engaged in conjuring. Cold drops of perspiration ran down my face, my arms, and the back of my neck. I was concentrating hard, trying to locate the source of her voice, trying to pinpoint the crash of the falls, trying not to move and tumble in, and trying most heartily not to be afraid, when my father let go of my hand. That was it, really. That was all he did. He loosened his hand from my grip, and he disappeared, never to be seen again, while the tour guide never stopped talking. July the 12th, 1968, the last day I saw my father. So that begins in a cave by the name of Ruby Falls. It's in Chattanooga, Tennessee. I can't see you, but raise your hand if you've been there. It is a cave that I visited as a little girl, and it scared me very badly. Probably scared me more than I realized until I started writing this book. So this book begins in that cave when a little girl by the name of Ruby, and yes, it is a double entendre. Yes, we are playing with that in every way. Ruby is taken there by her father. And as you heard at the very beginning, the lights are off. She hears the waterfall. She can't tell where the waterfall is because it's echoing all around her. And Dad disappears. When the lights come back on, he's gone. The tour guides, because it's 1968, they don't have any credit card records. They don't have any cameras. They assume, since she's 6 years old, that she didn't come into this cave alone. But they don't really remember who she came with. So they pick her up. They haul her up to the gift shop. They put her on a bench. They wait a couple of hours, and eventually they call the police. And the police come and get her, haul her back to the station, plunk her down on another bench, and they keep her there. And about 10 o'clock that night, little Ruby's mother realizes that her husband and her daughter are not just out to dinner. Something is radically wrong. She calls the police looking for the child and the husband. They match up the child that they have on the bench with the mother's description, and the mom comes to get her, and they're grounded in Chattanooga, Tennessee for the rest of the summer. The mother dealing with the search and the police inquisition, and the little girl in a state of shock. 20 years later, she has ditched the name Ruby, which was her middle name, and she goes by Eleanor Russell. She is an actress on a soap opera in New York City. So now we're in the late 80s, and she is written out under somewhat questionable circumstances. You don't know why she lost her job, but she lost her job. So young Eleanor, formerly Ruby, takes off for Europe. And there, because this is a psychological thriller with a heavily Gothic tone to it. And we can talk a little bit about what makes a story Gothic. I would say it is, a damsel in distress. Think of Jane Eyre, The Woman in White, Rebecca, a man who's more powerful, who may be malevolent, he may be benign, we don't really know. So Ruby, Eleanor, meets her tall, dark, handsome stranger whose name is Orlando Montague, which I just love that name. And he happens to be Anglo-Chinese, so making him even more exotic to her and more mysterious to her. But undaunted, she marries him just like that. After a few weeks of knowing him, she marries him. They go to Rome on a little honeymoon. They are about to descend into the catacombs under Rome. And our girl has, as you can well imagine, an attack of claustrophobia and has to be escorted up to sunshine. And she realizes, this is probably the moment she should tell this brand new husband about this thing that happened to her when she was a little girl. But she doesn't. So she begins her marriage with something of a secret. Off they go to Los Angeles, where they start a new life. They find the perfect cottage in the Hollywood Hills. To Eleanor, it reminds her of an English cottage. It's, got picket fence and roses and hollyhocks and everything else you can imagine that would make you think of an English cottage. And life is just perfect, and Orlando's perfect, and a little kitten wanders up their path. So now they have a perfect pet, and she is cast in a remake at Paramount Pictures of Rebecca, the Hitchcock film that was made based on the Daphne du Maurier book. And life couldn't be more perfect. And of course, you, the reader, are so far ahead of poor Eleanor, because she is just now noticing that Orlando is starting to change. And maybe he's not so perfect after all. And maybe he has a secret or two of his own. So that's the basic setup of the book. The story goes from there. So, like other Gothic thrillers that I mentioned, the book is most referential of Rebecca, but referential is, I mean, Rebecca is, it's like the diving board that this story kind of bounces off of and goes down a wilder path, a twistier path. I loved playing with this Gothic idea. So I write identity thrillers. That's what I call them. I don't know if that's really a name. My first novel, Finding Mrs. Ford, is not Gothic, but it also plays with concepts of identity. In that book, there's a woman in her mid-50s, Mrs. Ford, whose past catches up with her in Watch Hill, Rhode Island, when the FBI shows up one day to ask her about an Iraqi man who apparently was on his way to see her when they picked him up. She doesn't know that yet. So she at first lies and says she doesn't know the man. And then you go back to 1979 Detroit when she's 35 years younger, and you start to unravel what it is that she's hiding. So the books are structurally very different and tonally very different. But I would say, because I'm a movie person, I would say they both are Hitchcockian, because Hitchcock did a whole variety of types of thrillers, but they all, I think most of his movies dealt with that question of who people were, what they were revealing, and far more interestingly, what they were concealing. So for me, this idea of movies versus books and how they come together, I started my career first as a dancer and then as an actress in the television and the movie industry. My very first film, I was a dancer in a movie with Frank Langella and Tom Hulce, and it was called Those Lips, Those Eyes. And it was about summer stock theater at the turn of the last century. And that is a lyric from a song. And that's actually how I came to New York, because the choreographer of that film, which was shot in Cleveland, where I was in college, I was still in school when I was hired as a dancer in that film. He was the choreographer in-house for the Goodspeed Opera House in East Haddam, Connecticut. So he invited me to come and audition for him when I finished college. I don't think he really meant it. And when I called him up on the phone, when I learned that he was holding auditions at the Minskoff Theater in New York City, he was a little kind of waffly. I don't think he really wanted me to come. But I did come to New York. And I did audition for him, and I was not cast as a dancer at the Goodspeed Opera House, but I pursued dance at first and ended up transitioning to acting, where I had a lot more success. And I had a good run of it as an actress. I started on a soap opera called All My Children, and of course, Ruby Falls. I play with that. And people always ask, in your novels, how much do you take from your own life? So the answer to that, in a way, is kind of everything and nothing. I have been to Ruby Falls. I went there as a little girl. I remember it. I was very scared. My parents did not leave me there. So the story didn't happen, but obviously it was percolating in my consciousness. The funny thing about the beginning of Ruby Falls, I started this book about 2 years into Finding Mrs. Ford. So I started Finding Mrs. Ford in 2014. In 2015, I'd finished a draft, found an editor at a writing conference. By 2016, I had an agent, and I was right here in Riverside, Connecticut, where I am right now. And I'd been invited to dinner at the Riverside Yacht Club one night by friends. And a couple hours before I was going to go out the door, the first 2 chapters of Ruby Falls just downloaded into my brain, which was really an extraordinary experience because I had been tinkering around with some ideas for another book. It was not a book I planned to write. I was startled by that very dramatic beginning of, going from one cave to another cave. I have, like I said, been to both of those places, did not have those experiences. And then I had to figure out a book from there. So another thing people ask, well, how much is pure inspiration and how much is perspiration? So the first 2 chapters were pure inspiration, and then an entire book had to be a lot of work. So going back to my life, so I was on All My Children in 1982 and 1983, and I was written out, not with the same circumstances that you will find that our girl had. And shortly after that, within 10 months, I was flown out to Los Angeles to screen test for a project at Paramount Pictures, which is where I set her movie. And I've done other movies there. And so Paramount Pictures, it made such an impression on me. So much of Los Angeles made such an impression on me. And the book is mainly set there. So when I lived in LA from 1984 to 1992, I had a phenomenal acting career. I was doing movies, I was doing television, I was working nonstop, I was going on location. And I had this, young and fun life. And I left LA at a certain point and didn't go back for a long time. And my daughter moved to LA in 2015. And the first time I went to visit her, it was very emotionally overwhelming. And I think a lot of that really colors the mood of this book, even if you look at the title, the cover, which I do need to talk to you about. So when I went back to Los Angeles, so I've lived here in Riverside for 19 years, 19 years this month. And when you live in a place for a long time, you have the full range of emotional experiences that you would have, any life. But I pass Balducci's all the time. So if I had a really, terrible breakup in the parking lot of Balducci's or something, I wouldn't think about that every time I pass Balducci's because I pass it every day. But if you're away from a place for a long time and you suddenly go back, the full weight of all of that hits you. So I was like a nut. My daughter thought I was crazy. I would drive down the street and I'd say, "Oh, Tess, look, that was your pediatrician's office." Or, "Look, that's where I met your father." Or eventually that settled down. I didn't have that going on every time I drove around town, but I dedicate Ruby Falls to 4 people I was very close with in the years that I lived there, who all died. And so I think that was part of it. Young man who was my boyfriend at the time, we had done that show together at Paramount, and it was a show with Christopher Lloyd, if you remember him, Back to the Future. But this young man, Grant Forsberg from Massachusetts, he was my boyfriend. We later split up and married other people, but he died young in his 40s. When I first moved there, I lived with my friend Anna Martinez in this apartment in Beverly Hills. And Anna and I, she died in her early 40s. And this colored the book. One of the things Anna and I did, we got a hold of this book, which was a little more than a pamphlet. It was a very small book, but it was called Haunted Hollywood. And we drove everywhere. We were in the hills, we were in Malibu, we were downtown LA, and we were, I don't know, the house where Sal Mineo died and where Houdini lived and where Ramon Navarro died and where somebody ate ant paste to kill herself or something. I don't know, all these things. So we were on this kind of bender of doing all that. So that probably colored the book. Another friend, Lisa Knight, she lived on the street where I ended up setting Ruby Falls, this beautiful street in the Hollywood Hills. She was a young woman from Hawaii. She died. And my agent, Howard Goldberg, who died in the early 90s. And he's the basis for the character of the agent, Howard Silver, in the book. So the book is dedicated to those 4 people who were very dear to me, very influential on me. And they are, you know, part of my spiritual makeup now. So Ruby Falls is not a ghost story, but as a Gothic thriller, you do have that spooky feeling of not quite knowing what anything is or if there is something supernatural going on. So to continue moving forward with my life, tying books into my life, by the early 90s, I had 2 children, I was married. The bloom was off the rose with acting. We lived all the way east, farther east than the Hollywood Hills. We were in a little neighborhood called Atwater Village, which, if you know where the Hollywood sign is, we were way east of that. So I would get a call at that time at 6 o'clock in the evening to go pick up a script an hour away, which is a very challenging thing when you have 2 babies. So my first husband and I had an opportunity to move to Paris, where he'd grown up, and we did it. And this was right to date what was going on. This was right after the whole Rodney King beating and the riots in LA. So LA wasn't feeling very comfortable at that time. So we moved to Paris, and that began really the transition for me, long, slow transition to what would eventually be my writing career, because I was hired by a French film studio as a reader. And all film studios keep readers on the payroll. It's a freelance job where you read novels and screenplays and synopsize them and give notes to the studio executives and your recommendations of why it works or why it doesn't. So I did that while we were living in Paris. And then when we moved back to New York, my first husband took a job for the actress Julia Roberts. She had signed a development deal at Disney Studios, and I was hired by Miramax as the story editor, which is a fabulous job. It's like a book editor. So in the 90s, that's what I did. I worked at Miramax, and I always think of Miramax really as my writing school. I didn't go to graduate school for writing. I went to Miramax. And in those years, it was really the heyday of Miramax. And we had just the best of the best. So in having that time of working my fanny off, editing the writing of far greater writers than I was starting to really hone my understanding of what worked and what didn't work. The job was very intense. My children were young, and I ended up leaving the job to go back to more freelance reading. And within a few years, I divorced, and then a few years after that, remarried and moved to Connecticut. So that began the final pivot to a real writing career. So when I met my husband, he said to me, let's buy this theater in Stamford, Connecticut, the Avon, and we can reopen it. And because you were in the movie business. And I said, well, I mean, I don't really know anything about that end of the movie business, but we did it. And it's been one of the most fun and fabulous things I've ever done in my life. We have an incredible team. You probably know Louisa Green and Stuart Adelberg and Adam Birnbaum and great people who run our organization. But in doing the Avon, we ended up forming a close bond with the actor Gene Wilder, who for a decade would come to the Avon every fall, more than like 3 times, and talk about movies. And Gene and I developed a writing correspondence. And he said to me one day, "Are you a writer? I think you're a writer." And I said, well, kind of, I'm in writing groups. I've written a screenplay. So he offered to read something. I sent him the screenplay, and he was very encouraging. And every time I saw him after that, he would say, "Are you writing? I hope you're writing. I hope you're writing." So the point for me that was really a huge turning point, and I love saying this to younger people who sometimes feel that they have to do everything in youth. I can tell you, you don't have to do everything in youth. So there was this moment where my youngest child left the house. I had been writing for a long time. I belonged to a couple writing groups in Greenwich. And writing groups I would strongly recommend to any of you who are writers, because one of the things you get from being in a writing group is it's an interesting thing. When other people hear you read your writing, or they just read it, and they start to recognize what's distinctive about your voice, you start to build confidence in what's distinctive about your voice. And that over time can give you really the ability to tackle something larger. So in 2014, empty nest, I sat on the steps and cried for a little bit. And then I thought, I'm writing a book. I had an idea, and I took it on in a very serious way. And so one of the questions people ask is, how do you structure your time as a writer? So in the early years of writing, I had to fit in writing between other things I was doing. And bit by bit, I started to give up board commitments. But I would schedule my days always with 3 to 5 hour windows using my trusty iPhone, and time that I would just clear the slates. Post-COVID was a completely different thing. I had very clear slates. So that brings us more to the present moment. 14 months ago, I was in Florida. I was visiting Florida venues to promote my first book. And my granddaughter's birthday is March 13th. And that was kind of D-Day in my mind, Friday the 13th, where we knew this was something happening. So I basically sat where I was in Florida. I was in serious rounds of edits on Ruby Falls. I had signed a contract for that. We had chosen a publication date. We were in cover design and edits and metadata, which is just reams of stuff you have to write about yourself. That's more than anybody would ever want to know, including things like search words, and you can have hundreds of search words. But at the same time, I had an idea for a long time, and this is going into my third book. So my mother's best friend was murdered when my mother was 12 years old. This was 1948, and it was in Pittsburgh. And I think when an extreme act of violence like that happens near a person, that act of violence is not an isolated incident. It doesn't just affect the perpetrator and the victim. It affects a very wide circle of people. So my mother was not a member of the family. She was close friends with the girl who was murdered, but it had a profound effect on my mother. And I would say it had a profound effect on me. So last year I sat and started doing research on what really happened to that girl and what is known. And, you know, there's still things that are unknown. It's an unsolved crime. And out of that research has grown a book that I am now editing. It's finished-ish. I finished a draft in January. I'm polishing up a second draft now. I haven't shown it to an editor yet. So I'm at that point where you get where you think, I don't even know if this works, but that book, it's called Reef Road, which is named for a street in Palm Beach. And I love that name, Reef Road, because it sounds to me spooky. It sounds like a dangerous place. It sounds like you could run aground at any moment. And Reef Road is a street in Palm Beach, and it's also a beach. They call it Reef Road Beach, and it's a famous surfing beach. So I loved all the connotations of that. So Reef Road follows two narratives. There's the narrative of the writer. I have a middle-aged writer who lives alone in an apartment behind the Publix grocery store in Palm Beach with her dog, an old standard poodle, which we can get into that. You can ask me about animals in my book. All my people seem to have animals, dogs or cats. So the writer has a dog. She lives alone, and her sections are very contemplative. She is very deep into thinking about, writing about, and researching violent murders. And if you think about people like Dominic Dunn, whose daughter was murdered, and he became obsessed with, he became a great reporter of crime. Or you think about someone like Michelle McNamara, who solved the Golden State Killer. There's a terrific documentary. Someone was murdered in her neighborhood in Illinois as a girl, and that kind of became the genesis of her obsession. So my writer is that kind of person. At the same time, there's another narrative, which is like a book within a book. It's got separate chapters. And that is the story of a young woman named Linda Alonso, who's about 40, whose husband leaves her in the middle of the pandemic. He disappears with the two children, and he's from Argentina. And she believes that he's taken the children and gotten on a plane to Buenos Aires, and she can't follow because it's the pandemic. So the thing about that book, the pandemic is kind of an undercurrent. And it really, you think about how the pandemic affected us a year ago, and it's almost hard to imagine the headspace we were in then. We were in a place where, and I'm not really laughing, people were dying in terrible numbers. We didn't know if our Amazon packages would kill us. We were Cloroxing our bananas. It was crazy. I stopped having anyone clean my house, which was a terrible thing. I paid her not to come because I was trying to write books at home, and I was in Florida with my husband, who's not a tidy person, let me tell you, not a tidy person. My daughter, my son-in-law, a 1-year-old baby, and 3 dogs. So it was like dog hair was going in tumbleweeds, rolling through this house, and I didn't want to clean. So I developed a relationship with a Roomba. I don't know if you guys have a Roomba, but it's the greatest. This is a robot vacuum. And I named my Roomba Orlando after the man in Ruby Falls, Orlando Montague. So my favorite entity in the pandemic was this Roomba, because I could write and still not be living in utter squalor. So let's go back to Ruby Falls. So as I said, it is a Gothic thriller. And some of the themes I examine in Ruby Falls, always identity. What is Ruby hiding? What is Orlando hiding? Who are these people? What are they showing you? What are they not showing you? But also, Ruby Falls is a deep examination of trauma. And I'm certainly not a psychologist, but a terrible thing happens to her as a child. And I'm very intrigued by people who cope well with trauma, people who don't. I mean, why do some of us deal better or worse with these difficult things that happen to us when we're young? I remember some years ago watching the news, and a girl in Hawaii who was a surfer had been paddling out, and a shark bit off her arm. And she was a middle school girl, 12, 13 years old. And she was being interviewed, and she was fine. She was spunky. It didn't bother her. And it really struck me, because very often girls, when they go through puberty, become very self-conscious in not very good ways. They go from being the seer, the person who is the subject of their own world, to being the seen, the person who is the object of somebody else's world. That whole adolescent experience is, how do you see me? What do you think of me? Am I pretty? Am I fat? Am I smart? Am I good? Am I funny? So this girl, going back to resilience and identity, this girl who'd had her arm taken by the shark, she didn't seem to have that. And so I was really struck by that. So Ruby Falls is an examination of this trauma and how she copes with it. She, by setting the book in the time period that I do, so it begins in the 60s and it goes to the 80s, I mercifully allow myself freedom from technology, which made many issues much easier to deal with, both in the 60s and in the 80s. Ruby, by the time she's Eleanor as a young woman, she's very fixated on why her father left her. And because her name is Ruby, one of the ideas she considers is, why did it was her father who wanted to call her Ruby. Why did he want that? Did he maybe know Jack Ruby? Why did he disappear? Was he involved with the Kennedy assassination? Was he involved with the CIA or the KGB or the Cubans, or this thing called the Dixie Mafia, which is a real thing? I've read a couple books about it. And both of my first two books have been optioned for film or television. It's not sure which direction they'll go in yet. And the producer who has the rights to Ruby Falls was asking me if I would mind making it a contemporary book to our era, contemporary film or television show. And I said, well, maybe I'd love to see an idea of how you would do that, because if you had her nowadays, slightly conspiracy theory inclined, it could get very extreme because of the internet. She could go down rabbit holes completely in a way that in the 80s you just couldn't. You had to go to the library. So I would question moving it into the more modern era, but I would want to see kind of a take somebody had on that. So to really wrap up what I'm saying about my writing, I think I've made it clear, and I'd love to hear your questions in a minute, but I'm just fascinated with this idea of identity. I've met people in my life who are secret keepers. I think we're all secret keepers to a certain degree. I think most of our secrets are very benign, but occasionally you meet people who have darker secrets. When I was an actress, I played the woman who married Ted Bundy opposite Mark Harmon, and did a lot of research, of course, on Bundy when I was doing that show. And it was really startling to me that she married him. She married him at his last trial after I think it seemed pretty well known that he really was a sociopathic murderer. But I can only imagine that she didn't believe it. I don't think she would have married him if she thought he'd killed all those women. But so what's up with that? What was she thinking? What was he showing her? How did he convince her that he wasn't who the world was saying he was? And then, of course, in the 90s, when I was at Miramax, I worked for Harvey Weinstein. And I certainly don't question the young women, and I don't condone what he did. But I worked for him, and I didn't know that aspect of him. I didn't know him personally, but and Miramax was an incredible place for me. I learned so much, and I have a debt of gratitude to him for hiring me. So that is a fascinating thing. How is it that people show such different faces to different people? So that is really the core of what I write about, book after book, and it's something I'm interested in. So Jess, I think I'm ready to open it up to any questions that people have, and or anything they'd like to hear a little bit more about that I
Absolutely. Would anybody, if you would like, you can use the reaction function and raise your hand if you wanted to ask a question, or you're all are welcome to type anything you'd like into the chat. I would say, Deborah, I just have a question, and you may have already sort of answered this, but you said, you know, in your writing groups that the feedback you were getting, you were learning, you know, what was distinctive about your voice, and that's what was, you know, giving you so much confidence. Was that distinction, you know, related to the identities that you were sort of developing and these secrets, and, you know, that a lot of your characters might be, you know, hiding something, or was it something else that was very distinctive about your writing?
That's a really good question. Well, one thing that was distinctive, and I didn't talk about it yet, is I like to really develop a strong sense of place. For me, being rooted in place in a novel is extremely important. And I set my fictitious stories in real places, whether they're Watch Hill or Detroit or Los Angeles or Palm Beach. And so I think that was one of the things that my fellow writers reacted to, my descriptions of place. And it's just something I love reading. I'll never forget when I first read Shadow of the Wind, which is set in Barcelona. And I've never been to Barcelona. And first of all, it's a rip-roaring story, but I also love the description of place. So that was part of it. And then, yes, also maybe just a little bit of a twist. I think my writing always has a little twist in it. Maybe it wasn't as clearly defined as identity issues in various short stories, but a little bit that. So yes.
Thank you. It looks like Louisa has typed a question in, and she says, do you miss your characters when you finish your book? They are so much a part of your life while writing the book. What happens when you finish writing?
So they're sort of real to me, Louisa. That's a really good question. And we're all friends with a man called Michael Kovner, who makes a lot of movie references. And my husband's always saying, oh, Michael, is that real or is that a movie? But for me, books, movies, reality, I mean, I understand the difference, but it does sort of blend. Like, I will look at something or experience something, and I'll think about Susan Ford, or I'll think about Ruby, or I'll think about Linda Alonso. So they're kind of there in my mind. So the interesting thing now is this whole movie television process. So finding Mrs. Ford, I can't tell you who, but an actress has just attached herself to play the mature Mrs. Ford, and she's phenomenal. And she doesn't want us to announce who she is until a writer is chosen, a screenwriter. It won't be me. And one of the things I was asking my agent is, I mean, I know that they can do whatever they want. They can take Watch Hill and make it Malibu. They can take, I have a Chaldean character, which is an Iraqi Christian. They could make that guy a Saudi or a Palestinian. But I've asked if I can at least have a consultation with the screenwriter to explain why. You know, why did I choose Chaldeans particularly? it's a group that has a big presence in Detroit? Or why did I choose Watch Hill? And what's the difference between Watch Hill and Malibu? And why there? So if I can have that consultation, I mean, at the end, they can do what they want to do once they take off. But yeah, it'll be, I'm thrilled with the actress who's attached to play Mrs. Ford. But who knows, some of the others, you never know how casting goes or how these characters turn out. I mean, think about, Scarlett O'Hara being played by Vivian Leigh. I'm sure people who read the book first or the writer maybe pictured that character differently. Who knows?
See. So anybody is welcome to write questions in the chat, or raise your hand with the raise your hand function. Deborah, you told us a little bit about what you're working on right now, and it sounds like how you had mentioned that this book actually you were working 2 years ago into finding Mrs. Ford. Could you tell us a little bit more maybe about what you are working on right now?
Yeah, so that's Reef Road, which is what I'm working on right now. But let's talk a little bit about the time process. So for me, it takes about a year to have a draft of a book. And then, the editorial process, it can be a long process. I have some friends and colleagues, other writers who do a book a year, and that's wonderful. I don't think I'll ever be in that zone of a book a year. For me, there's kind of almost a mystical factor that time adds to the creation. And no matter how many ideas you get when you're actually writing, you also get ideas when you step away from the writing, when you're going to sleep or waking up or walking or taking a shower. Ideas can come to you, and those are often very important ideas that can change your work and make your work better. And some of that for me unfolds over time. Like I finished a draft of Reef Road in January, and it's now the beginning of June, and I'm just finishing my second draft, this polish of it. And what I do is after I finish a draft, I print it out and I read it and do hand notes, and then I revise it. And with Reef Road, because it's complicated with the two narratives, I've restructured a good bit of it. So that it takes time and it's work. And so there, I just don't want to rush myself. So I don't know when Reef Road will come out. So no, it's at the point where I have to show it to some beta readers and see if I'm crazy or not, see if it works. The thing about Reef Road that I question, the thing that throws it much more into literary fiction, is the narratives are stylistically very different. The section of the writer, and like I said, is very contemplative and very philosophical. And the section of Linda Alonso is sort of a tracking, plotted thriller, which is a little more noir-ish. So does it all work together? We'll find out. Think of The French Lieutenant's Woman, and I'm not comparing myself to Fowles, but that was an interesting postmodernist book where you had two different time periods and you had actors playing parts, but then having relationships, and it was complicated and unusual, and I loved it.
One thing you had mentioned was that you would tell us a little bit more about the artwork that's on the book cover.
Oh, yes. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to hold this up. This is a photographic work of art by an artist called Melanie Wilhide. She got an MFA at Yale, and she was in California doing getting ready to do a show when her computer was stolen. And about 3 weeks later, the police retrieved the computer, returned it to her, and she spent a long while trying to access her work. because the thief had tried to swipe the computer clean, wipe it or swipe it. I don't know how you say it. And when she got it back, you might be able to see it better here. Everything is kind of sliced. It's sort of hard to see. And that was how the pictures came out. So she created a whole body of work based on what happened. And she had a show called To Adrian Rodriguez with Love. Adrian Rodriguez was her thief. And this work is called Grace and Thorns. And we acquired it really as is. We didn't change anything of it. And I think it's a perfect fit for Ruby Falls because I think it's both beautiful and odd and eerie, which is how I would describe this book. So that was kind of a miracle that this piece of work came to me. And I think it's the perfect cover for the book, and it's getting incredible response.
It definitely is the perfect fit. We have an anonymous question, and that is, what were your favorite books or characters growing up?
So as a young child, I liked books like The Secret Garden. And then going into teenage years, it was definitely Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre and The Woman in White and Rebecca and, you know, things like Anna Karenina too. And then, so that's kind of where I was as a young person. And going into my 20s, when I was in college, I had a friend give me a book by Nancy Mitford, and it's two novellas, Pursuit of Love and Love in a Cold Climate. And those two novellas are, in a weird way, they've become kind of my comfort book. I mean, they're together in one volume. And it's the story of a very eccentric English family in the period before World War I, after World War I and before World War II, in this ramshackle country house in England. And they're rambunctious and fractious and funny and, like I said, eccentric. And that's a book that I return to every few years if I'm feeling kind of anxious or unsettled. I don't know why that book just makes me feel kind of serene and rooted, because it wasn't set in a peaceful world. I mean, they were, you know, between the wars, it was the Depression, but oddly, that's my comfort book, which I read every few years.
That is super interesting. Thank you. Does anybody else have a question that they want to type in, or they can send us anonymously? I think we may be out of questions at this time.
Well, thank
Kevin,
you.
yeah, Kevin or Kathy, would you like to sort of close us out?
Deborah, this is Kevin at Director of Perrot Library. Thank you so much. You are an amazing storyteller, and I would be remiss if I didn't remind everyone to please come by the Historical Society in Greenwich tomorrow, where you'll be appearing, so people can purchase a copy of your book and you'll be available to sign it. And thank you very much for coming, and all of the participants in tonight's program. And of course, we can't wait for your next book. So thank you again. And thank you everyone for coming tonight. Have a good evening.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you, Kathy. Thank you, Jess. Thank you, everyone. Maybe I'll see you tomorrow. It's going to be nice weather. And they have lots of veggies. So come buy veggies and flowers and books.
Thank you, Deborah. We'll see you tomorrow then.
Thank you.
Have a great evening, everybody.
Okay, you too. Bye.
Bye.